Welcome to A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to My Life. This is the place to be for stories to inspire and uplift when life doesn't go according to our plans. I'm Laura Muirhead, your host and the reigning queen of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to My Life. I can't wait to share the plot twist stories of my guests that will inspire and uplift you when life didn't follow the plan, right here on A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to My Life podcast. Hi, and welcome to this episode of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to My Life. I'm your host, Laura Muirhead, and I am so happy to welcome back to A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to My Life, a previous guest, Michelle Ann Collins. So Michelle was on in April, actually, was when your episode aired. And a lot has happened in that time, but come first, before we get into everything, come and remind our listeners who you are, what you do, and where you are in the world.
Okay, great. Laura, thanks so much for having me back. I love your podcast. It's so relaxed and like just chatting with a friend over coffee. Or tea in my case today. So I'm Michelle Ann Collins. I'm an author and a yoga therapist, wellness coach, and grief coach. And there's more, but if you want, it's a long list of things that I do. But basically, I promote mindful healing. So I use the studies in mindfulness and meditation and yoga to help people get through or recover from difficult times. That's sort of my goal. And I have 3 books out and 2 coming out next month, although I think it'll be next month when this airs. So anyway, January of 2023. And I am a coach, so I help people one-to-one. My yoga therapy practice is also one-to-one. So if someone has an injury or an illness and they want to still have yoga in their life, I can manage to modify yoga to their needs. And I teach a couple of group classes as well.
You definitely have a full plate, but I love that because I am multi-passionate as well. So I love that you do many things. So
Multi-passionate, I like that.
Pardon?
Multi-passionate, that's a great word. I like that.
Yeah, because like you don't have just one thing that you love doing. And I also love that you can work with people with your yoga practice. So, if they do have other things happening, that you're able to adjust things for them that way.
Yeah. People say, oh, I can't do yoga because, fill in the blank, whatever it is. Like I have a bad knee, I had a, whatever. Some of my students can't even stand up. They're in wheelchairs.
Wow.
As long as you can breathe, you can do yoga, and you can do yoga in a way that's beneficial to your health. So it's a really wide, broad practice, and people don't realize that. People think, oh, I'm not bendy, I'm not strong, I can't stand on one foot, I can't do yoga. And that's just not the case. It's a healing modality. No matter where you are, you can feel better with yoga in your life. So I feel like I'm a promo code there.
But I know we've kind of gone off like this. I think that's an important point to make, because I do think people limit themselves with that idea that, that people who are doing yoga are, like you can't go because if you're already not, you have to start somewhere. You're not going to, just like a marathon runner or anything, I think people think, like you said, you can't go to yoga because you're not bendy or you're not stretchy or you're, whatever. And I love that you can make those adjustments for people. And I do know that there are a lot of people, my mom, for example, who is, older, and there's somebody in her area that teaches a chair yoga class. So and I think it's so beneficial for everyone. So And
Yeah,
here I am,
it is. And
here
I
I am
love
sounding like I do it, and I don't. I need to get on your programs and do it.
well, I'll contact you afterwards and get you into one of my classes. But it is, yoga is very misunderstood in a lot of ways. That, saying yoga is like, people say, I don't do yoga. It's like saying I don't exercise, or, there's yoga, just saying yoga is such a broad term. And I know someone who I was talking to recently who said they don't do the physical practice of yoga anymore. They just do the mindfulness, meditation, and spiritual part of the path. So, but they don't do what you're thinking when I say yoga is, downward dog and all that. They don't do that, and they're still doing yoga. So
Okay, that we need to do that on another podcast. We need to go down the yoga path on a
okay.
other I mean, there's a lot to that, obviously. I
It's
did
an
do
eightfold path.
I did do hot yoga once with my daughter in LA, so that was really interesting. So
Yeah, a big part of yoga is finding the right genre and the right teacher.
so last time you were here on the podcast, we were talking about a lot of the loss that you've experienced in your life, and how how you've navigated that, how you moved through that, and helped you heal from those experiences. And one of the big ones, and in one of the big things you have coming up that relates to that, is that you have a book, two books coming out around helping others, but also I believe one of your books, you tell me more, was about is about how you navigated healing from your husband committing suicide.
Yes, yeah, that was the main purpose of me starting to write. And just I'm going to throw in the grief education piece here. The suicide loss community and grief and trauma communities are shifting the way we talk about suicide to try to lessen the stigma, because a lot of the extra layers of grief that you and I talked about on the last podcast, the extra layers of difficulty of losing someone to suicide, are the stigmas and the social taboos that are associated with suicide. And often suicide is just a really extreme mental illness, and all of mental illness is becoming less and less stigmatized, which I love. People are really talking openly about depression, anxiety, PTSD, and it's just making our world such a more compassionate place, which is why I'm even doing the work I do with grief and grief education. So now what we're saying is died by suicide rather than committed suicide, because committed has that stigma, committed a crime, right? So you want to try to change the way you talk about suicide, if you can, to died by, because you die from a heart attack, or you die from cancer, you die from suicide. It takes the stigma out of the way we talk about it.
That makes a lot of sense to me when you say it that way, because it is how you died by. Like, you wouldn't say somebody committed a heart attack. Like, hopefully weren't committed to having a heart attack. So yeah, I like that. And like you said, we are becoming so much more aware of other mental illnesses as well, and being more compassionate about it. So I believe when we talked, if I remember correctly, you thought you had planned at that time for one of your books to be published in August.
Yes.
And I believe that didn't happen that way.
No, a funny thing happened on the way to my book publication, Laura. And it's funny in the same way that the other tragedies and traumas I've talked to you about on the first podcast. it was actually just after you and I recorded, and I was on target to get that book published. I wanted to be published in August, ahead of Suicide Awareness Month, which is September. And my publisher died
Oh my goodness.
suddenly, just completely unexpected. And there was no like plan in place. There was no sort of like assistant publisher and strategy in the company. What do we do if she dies? And it was really her company, and she'd been doing this for decades. She had over 17,000 best-selling authors best-selling books that she had published. I mean, she was really, really well established, and yeah, and I didn't even know at first what was wrong. I just knew I wasn't hearing from her. And then I did some research. I spoke with a mutual friend because she was the publisher on one of the books I'd contributed a chapter to the year before. And that's how I found out. And so it took a few weeks for me to even get in touch with anyone at the company. And they just said, we're in chaos. We don't know what's going on. They couldn't access her files. So they didn't even have my book. And I mean, I had it, of course, but it was a funny thing. I was definitely panicked. I went through a grief process. I really did. At first I was just in denial, and then I was angry, and then I was sad, and I kind of got a little hopeless because it has been a very long journey with this book. I first got the message from the universe, if you will, from in April of 2017. And here it was April of 2022. So it had been 5 years in the making. And all of a sudden that publication rug got pulled out from under me.
That had to be, I mean, that had to be huge. And especially like when you're sitting there going, I haven't heard from her for a while. It's not like somebody, like you said, from the company notified you, hey, we've got, this happened. So, and oh my gosh, I can't even imagine, but interesting too, the process that you went through of, being, angry and disheartened and all the things. I can imagine that as well. Like here you've put so much work into something and you found a publisher that you were happy to work with. And then what am I going to do now? So
Yeah.
what did you do ultimately? Like, how did you find another publisher?
Well, a funny thing happened, right? So my friend that I actually, one of the books that I contributed a chapter to, I have it here so it's called You Can't Make This Story Up. What if it's all happening for us? So she was the coordinator of that book. And she just happens to have started a publishing company last year. And so this is someone I've worked with. We worked together creating my stories. She was a huge help in my healing from my husband's suicide because she taught me the power of healing, of a story healing. It was incredible. I mean, I went through so much healing working with her in writing projects. So she was kind of like a book coach. I don't know, book therapist. Anyway, she also, like you and I, wears lots and lots of hats, but and started a publishing company. So I talked to her about it and I said, can you take this that I have and recreate the book? And she said yes, but not by August. So I signed on with her. I started working with her and just slowed everything down. I gave up the timeline, like it'll come out when it comes out, And then in August, I started actually working on the content with her. So I handed her the manuscript. Not really. I hit send on the computer, but sent the manuscript to her, and we started working on it together. I guess in July. In August, I sent her my final manuscript. And here's the second funny thing that happened. So on your previous podcast that I did with you, I was talking about a book. Remember that?
Mhm.
So the night I sent my manuscript off, okay, it's ready to go, through the professional editing process, the design process, all that. I'm signing off. That night, I got another message from the universe. And the message was, you have to write a companion guide. You have to write a book for those people who are supporting people going through the loss that you went through, because nobody knew what to do. And I realized that in writing the first book, so much of my suffering was due to things that happened after he died. There wasn't just this cohesive, everybody get together and grieve and support each other, and then more support for me as time goes on. People didn't know what to say, they didn't know what to do. A lot of people said and did the wrong thing that actually added to my suffering. So that's what this book is for. It's for the people that are my supporters, or were back then, to know what to do.
So the first book is about your experience with dealing with your husband dying from suicide.
Yes.
And then this companion one comes along. And I think that is my, well, here's my question. So when I don't even want to use the word normally, like it's coming out of my mouth, but
Okay.
when somebody dies in a different way, people come together, like you said, people come together and they grieve and they support the person, each other, but also if there is a spouse or someone that's a partner or someone who lived with them or is close, maybe I don't want to say closer, but they would be there for that person. And in your experience, it's sort of like you said, like it's people that are, we don't know what to do. We don't know what to say. We don't know how to support these people who have lost someone by suicide. It's a totally different experience. I'm actually, that's actually a question, even though it doesn't sound like one.
Yes, no, I understand the question. I talk about that a lot, and grief is grief. So no matter how your loss happened, and it's not just a matter of, we don't just grieve people who die. We grieve, when we move, we grieve our old communities. With COVID, we had this community, this worldwide collective grief that happened, grieving the lives we had before COVID. So it's not just, and certainly, when friendships break up, divorce, pet death, I mean, all of that is grief. So all of that is filled with the regular, let's say, I almost said normal too, but grief is a very normal human process. It's just that we're not educated about it in our culture. So when you add suicide on top of grief, what it does is it increases the shame and the guilt. Oftentimes in non-suicide related grief, there's shame and guilt, especially if it's the end of a relationship. If a relationship ended badly, no matter whose contribution was the biggest to the end of the relationship, there's always guilt and shame involved. So when you add suicide, then you really do say, how could I have stopped this? If it's cancer, you don't say, how could I have stopped this? Unless you're an oncologist, I guess. If it's a car accident, even a car accident, people are like, oh, if only they weren't on their way to, especially if they were on their way to visit you. There's so much guilt involved in grief. So with suicide, it's just next level. You really, almost all suicide loss survivors feel like they should have done more. They could have stopped it. And the fact of it is, especially after going through this grief educator course, I realized you can't stop it. If someone's determined to die, if someone's determined to end their life, you can't stop it. So for all of you suicide loss survivors out there who are listening to this podcast, you could not have changed this outcome. And if you can even let a tiny bit of that in and accept that, then you're going to start to heal.
That is, yeah, thank you for that. That's an important message, for sure. And I imagine that's, like you're saying, is a really a hard part of it, a hard piece of the puzzle when you've experienced that. Um, I want to go back to your new publisher, your that was, like you said, it sounds like that just really worked out the way it was supposed to. Not that your first publisher should have passed away, but that you were able to find this person who already was super supportive of you and that you had worked with before. And I actually, a couple of your co-authors, that's how we came to meet, was through some of your other co-authors initially. um, I had never experienced a co-authored book before, so when I read some of your chapters, I was like, that's super interesting. But I had seen people who were promoting a co-authored books. And so a funny thing that happened to me was that I actually turned down an opportunity to write in a co-authored book. I think it was at the end of last year. I didn't have time, whatever. And in August, that same opportunity came back around. And for some reason, I was like, yes, I'm going to do this. And then, of course, by then it was like, you've got to do it like right now, because it had been, everybody had been working on things for months. And so I see, I experienced firsthand the struggle of putting a story out there, like even a chapter, so for you to not only have this one book out that's really personal and your experience, but then also the companion to it, to help others. I can see where your publisher, the second publisher that you ended up with, is just plays a really big role in that, and supporting you and to releasing this out, and both of them out into the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I call her a book doula because it really is like giving birth, in a lot of ways, not as physically painful, I hope, but it's, there's just a lot of preparation, a lot of anticipation, and it's your creation. You have created this being, and then there's a lot of fear in letting it out into the world, because people are going to see it and they're going to say something about it. People always say stuff about your baby, whether you want them to or not. So, but in this case, I'm just, my greatest wish for these books is just that they land in the hands of the people who they can help. Because I certainly didn't write it for my comfort or my process, although writing is healing, and I do talk about that in the book, writing your story. But it's hard, like you have now experienced. It's really hard to write a book, especially about your own personal experience, and it's not comfortable at
And
all.
I just, yeah, and I think that for you, and for a lot of people, that the idea that you're hopefully that your story is going to touch other people, that it's going to inspire them, that it's going to help support them, help them heal, all of those things is really, helps the author, helps you as author, helped me as an author. And but also I think, like you're saying, I love that you said some people are gonna say things about your baby, whether you want them to or not, and sometimes people put their foot in it when they're, like, oh, look at that cute little baby, whatever. And you're like, no, it's a boy, or, she's a girl, or whatever it is, or, somebody maybe, being nice and saying something else about them, but thinking they're being nice. Oh, look at those chubby cheeks, and you're triggered by it, whatever it is. But certainly with your writing, the potential criticism and the potential when it is your story, and there's probably other people. I mean, just you tell me if there's, other people that might be involved that you have to kind of like just put your guard up against, because they might come at you and say, well, that's not how that story went, or how dare you. I mean, it takes a lot of courage, I think, for you to put this story out.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I do have fear of how the people that knew Glenn will react, even to listening to podcasts that I'm interviewed on. And so I had to do a lot of work around that to prepare. My story is my story. And what I'm reporting in this book is, it's not like some tell-all, trying to get people all excited and like some memoirs and things are. It's a book about how to survive difficult times. And it's how I survived the difficult times. And if my facts don't line up with people's facts, because we all have different experiences, even in the same room, listening to the same thing, people can come away with two very different experiences, because you come to the experience with all of your past and all of your biases and all of your education. So I wouldn't be surprised if anyone who was involved in my life at that time reads the books, if they are surprised by something I say in there, because maybe they had a very different experience. And toward the very end of Glenn's life, I think I mentioned in the last podcast, we were separated. And he was hanging out with some people that were hearing a very different story about what was going on. So those people, who I very much doubt will, follow me or read anything I write, but if they do, they're going to have a very different point of view than what than my experience that I'm reporting. So I just have to understand that we all have our own experiences. And I'll give an example. When we have heightened emotions, which everyone did around the end of my marriage, of course. When my mom was first diagnosed with leukemia, my dad and my mom and I all went to visit the specialist after having gone to the first doctor, second, the general oncologist, and then the leukemia specialist. So when we're visiting with the leukemia specialist, it's the three of us and him in the room. So all three of us are hearing everything that we're all saying, right? Right? And then the three of us get in the car after we leave the doctor's office for the drive back to my parents' house. And we had such incredibly different experiences. You would not believe that the three of us were even in the same room. My mom was like, well, that wasn't so bad. My dad and I are, crunching the numbers, right? Listening to the prognosis and and trying to figure out when she's going to die. And my dad was just like, well, this isn't happening. And there was just, it was like three. I even said, I remember sitting in the back seat saying, were you two even in the same room as I was? So my point by telling this story is that, especially when emotions are heightened, our memory and our interactions can be very affected.
Yeah, this is something that that's been swirling around me for the last month or so, is the stories that we tell. And just like that. And it also reminds me when you're talking about it, why if police interview multiple witnesses, and depending on your vantage point or depending on whatever, somebody might say, well, the guy had on a red shirt, and then somebody else might say he had a blue shirt or whatever. So yeah, there's clearly, a lot to that. And probably in the situation with your parents, like you're saying, your mom's emotional state and her possible denial of what was going on, or whatever it is. I don't want to say that your mom had that. I'm just saying that a lot of times when people are unwell, that's why you want to bring the family members with, because they're not going to hear, they're not going to. But yeah, but I also think that this is the part of what's been coming up for me, is that the stories that we tell and the stories that we stick with, and the stories, or like you're saying, with your husband, that you know people don't know that you don't know the full story. You only know pieces of it potentially, or you only know what that person is telling them. And when a lot of times when these things come out, and this is where I think it's a struggle, potential struggle, is that they're totally believable stories. I keep using this example of the guy in Catch Me If You Can, that movie. I mean, that was a real life person, and he was a lawyer, he was a doctor, he was a pilot. And when he's telling the story, that was fully believable. There was nothing to not believe. Like, people are like, yeah, sure he is. Like, I know him as a doctor, right? I mean, these are extreme examples of somebody's story. But when somebody tells a certain story of whatever it is in their life, it's generally, I mean, sometimes somebody's story is not believable, but generally people are like, oh yeah, great story. Like, of course it's believable. But when you get the other pieces of that story, or the other vantage points of those people's story, that's when people are like, well, that's unbelievable, because they are so solidly fixed on the story that they told, that they believe, because why wouldn't they?
Right.
So I think that's where the trouble comes in, and that opens the door also for people to say, well, that can't be right. There's no way that could have happened, or who. And so I love that you're saying, basically, this is your experience, this is your vantage point, this is the story that you experienced, um and that's all you can do, is tell it from your story and your vantage point. And I think that's important, also because you did it, all of your emotions are tied up in that, all of your grief and all of your experiences that you had from him dying in general, but dying from suicide as well. So the fact that you, again, are brave enough to share that with people is incredible.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a point I want to get just a little bit further, that we were both touching on with this, and that is the vantage point. The experience that you can have. And when I'm explaining this to clients, one of the examples I use is, if you're looking, say you're with a group and you're all looking at the same thing, and say you're looking at a tree or a forest, and someone's favorite color is green, what they're going to see is the leaves. And they do studies on this. You can have 10 people look at the same thing and then turn around and tell you what they saw, and they saw 10 different things, because it's what is already conditioned in their mind, what they brought up with, what their beliefs are. And an example I like to use is, when you're looking out the window, you could see, say the window's open and there's a screen over it. It's just like what your phone's going to focus on. You can see the spider web on the screen. You could see the screen. You could see the tree right outside the window, or you could see the forest beyond the window, or the traffic, or whatever. And none of those experiences are wrong. They're just different. So the problem that we get into is when screen watcher number 1 says, there's a spider there and it's scary and it's going to bite you. And screen watcher number 2 says, there's a beautiful flower, and then they fight about who's right when actually they're both having their own experience. And I think that people, especially in our current climate, have lost so much compassion for other people's point of view. We used to be able to sit in a room and talk about things we completely disagreed about and just be in disagreement and recognize, even sometimes with compassion, that, oh, that's just Uncle Charlie's got his band, and so everything he sees is music, and he's always talking about the music, not the movie, and so-and-so's got their characters that they like to focus on, and so they only see the story. And none of that is wrong. What's wrong is when you step across and tell someone they're wrong, when it's possible they're not wrong, they're just having a different experience than you are.
I love that. I think that's really important. And I know a lot of people say, well, there's 2 sides to every story, but I generally say there's 3 sides to every story, because there's your side, there's my side, and then there's what actually happened. And potentially, maybe none of us saw what actually happened because of exactly what you're saying, because of the vantage point or because of whatever. And I love your example as well about the phone. I've tried to take photos through my window multiple times, and it's like, what, you're focusing on the screen and I want to see the squirrel that's in the tree behind it. Like, please take the picture of the squirrel. So yeah.
Right. And you get a picture of the screen, but that doesn't make it any less real. Right? You could show someone the picture of the screen and tell them there's a squirrel in this picture. And they're like, well, I don't see it. And you could get in a total argument about it.
Right.
If you have people that are kind of, bullheaded or whatever.
Well, and again, like you said, that especially in this environment, everybody wants to be right, whether it's on social media or in person or whatever. And we all have our vantage point of what we experienced, and all of our experiences are valid. I want to talk a little bit about your companion book, because tell me if I remember this correctly from our other episode. Um, did somebody come to you and ask you to reach out, and that you at first were resistant to that, to reaching out to other people, or am I imagining this?
No, you remember the story. Yeah, there's a story, and I did write about this in both books. But the 2 books are very similar because it's sort of this journey image of everyone traveling on the grief and healing journey together. So a lot of the content in the 2 books is the same. So my biggest dream would be that the suicide loss survivor and their friends and family companions would read that, so the both parties would have these skills and ability to communicate. So that's kind of my greatest wish, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, yes, about 9 months after Glenn died, I had a friend who we were friends with. Glenn and I were friends with this couple, and the husband died by suicide. Then it was just 9 months, like I said, after Glenn died, and a friend of mine told me about it, and I was very resistant in calling her because I felt like there was nothing I could do. I didn't have my feet underneath me. I was still very deep in grief and PTSD from the trauma of the suicide, and it was, I even said, I can't call her. And then I got to thinking, well, who else but me, I would be the right person. That my friend was, encouraging me. You are the only person who understands what she's going through. So eventually I did make that call. It took me a while, and I just called and I said, I'm sorry. I had no tools, no idea what to say to help her. But that call was a connection. And what I learned in my grief educator course is the first thing grievers need is just to be witnessed. They just need people to see their pain. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to bright side them. Oh, it'll be okay. He's in heaven now. That doesn't make a griever feel better. You just witness, just start by witnessing their pain. And that's hard because that means you're sitting there in pain with them. And that's what we're not trained or conditioned to do. We're conditioned to do something to fix it. And that's really, really hard. So that first opportunity for me to help someone, I was not ready to. And it helped me realize that just being there is one of the greatest things we can do for someone in grief.
I think that it sounds like what you have to offer, it goes beyond, just helping. I mean, obviously it's meant for, um in your books, in the case of your books, it's obviously meant to help people who have experienced suicide in their lives, but it really goes beyond that. It goes to anyone who, like you said earlier, has experienced grief or is going, through these things. The tools sound like they're incredible.
I think so. I think so. I think, especially the mindfulness part of it. I really think mindfulness is the key to happiness. I really do. The key to survive, just not suffering so much.
Yeah.
And it's not, the book isn't just all about that. Some of it's about how to get out of bed and how to eat and, just how to be in grief. But yeah, everyone that's read it, all of my pre-readers and the editors and things like that have said, you need to write this same book, but for a more general audience. So the books, I still haven't said the title. So the first book is Surviving Spouse or Partner Suicide Loss, a mindful guide for your journey through grief.
Mhm.
And then the second one, Supporting a Survivor of Spouse or Partner Suicide Loss, a mindful guide for co-journeying through grief. And so it's a very, very specific audience, but that is the audience that I was told to write the book for by the universe, God, spirit, my soul, the message I got from beyond. And so that's what I did. Now we'll see what happens next. We'll see how the book's received. And if I keep getting messages that I should write a book that's a more general audience and that it would help more people, then I might do that. We'll see what happens. Writing a book is really hard. So I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't want to talk about the next one quite yet.
Let's get these two out into the world. And now tell me, will they be available on Amazon when they're published?
Yeah, they'll be on Amazon and in all the bookstores, everywhere books are sold.
Everywhere
Um,
books are sold. I love that.
yeah, but Amazon, of course, is, they have 60 or 70% of the book sale market now. So to not have a book on Amazon is kind of tough for sales. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm hoping the launch date, the release date is January 26th, 2023. So hopefully if people are in that population or know someone who is, they can buy the book on that day. The reason that I would love more people to buy it that day is it helps bring it up in the rankings, and that way it's more visible, and that way it will get again to more people who it will help. And that's the whole point of writing the book, is the books is to hopefully help some people. And I know they already are, because I've already gotten a call from someone who is supporting a survivor of partner suicide loss, and she called me and I basically just told her what was in the book, and she was very much helped by that. So
Good.
I know
That's
I've already helped at least one person.
That's fabulous. So, I oh, okay, so I want to go back to something, but yeah, for our listeners, mark your calendar for January 26th, 2023, because it is important to help get that. Is it going to be available on Kindle as well? Or I shouldn't say Kindle, as an ebook as well?
I think so, yeah. That's
Okay, so that's
it
important as
should
well
be
to,
out that day, the same day. And then the audiobook, I've started working on that. So there will be an audiobook, but it probably won't be ready on launch day.
that's amazing. So yeah, I know a lot of people love their audiobooks. So I love that you're all the way across all the
Oh, me too. I
platforms.
love my audiobooks too. I love listening to a book.
It is important for, if you don't know, as a listener, to support the book launch on the day. And um, I know Michelle's going to be posting on her, her social media. I'm going to be reminding people on my social media as well, because I think this is a really important topic, and I love the idea of both of these books. I want to go back to one thing before we wrap up. uh, I have experienced a few people um, who have had a loss from suicide, and it seems like sometimes it's hard for those people to move past um, not only the guilt and shame, but then possibly the blame, like pointing fingers at somebody else. Like, let's say that it was somebody who lost their son or their daughter, and they're pointing at the partner, as like, well, they did such and such, or they were acting this way, and if they would have, did, I mean, can you address that at all as well?
Sure. Yeah. And I had that finger pointed at me. I mean, we were separated. I had asked him to move out a few weeks before he died. And because he was very irrational and had started to his behavior had started to frighten me. Uh, and so yeah, a lot of people pointed that finger right at me. And at the time, I was helpless. I had nothing to say other than I feel so terrible. And so I think two things. One is suicide's nobody's fault. Suicide is the fault of mental illness within the person who ended their life. There's no stopping it. There's no changing it. If someone is absolutely determined to end their life, it doesn't have anything to do with usually the rest of our reality, because we're telling them, don't end it. We're here for you. And there were people telling him that. So, and I'm sure anyone who's listening who's had a suicide loss, suicide prevention is sometimes uh sometimes works, but the person has to be willing to let go, right? They have to be willing to stay here, and sometimes they're just not. So it's not your fault. It's not anyone's fault except the person who took their life.
Well, and also on the other side of that, some of the people, public figures who we've seen, who of course we don't personally know, but come across as, happy people, or, like, for example, Robin Williams, or more recently Twitch, that, came across as like super happy, like super, you know, joyful people, and that we look to, even, to enjoy their what they put out in the world, and then, something happens. So there's also that side of it, and I think what you said kind of speaks to that as well.
Yeah, I actually I don't follow too many people on social media that I don't know. And I follow Twitch and Allison, and they gave me so much joy during COVID, is when I found them. I actually wrote a blog about it last week. That's on my
Oh,
website. It was really, really hard for me. I was devastated when I found that out. And I'm sure a lot of people that didn't ever know Twitch personally are grieving. And, we don't know the backstory. We don't know if anyone knew that he was having problems. They're public figures, and the public side isn't always the side everyone sees. Even between me and Glenn, we certainly weren't public figures, but nobody really knew what was happening between the two of us. People knew my story and the story he was telling. So you never know. And I think that probably the most comforting or the biggest offering I can make at this point is, if you are a suicide loss survivor, you may never be able to understand why. And I remember when I was able to let go of the why and to let go of the self-blame and shame and guilt, that was huge. I was able to start living my life. And the fact is, they're gone and we're still here. And that might sound harsh, but it is hours of agony trying to undo what happened, trying to understand what happened. It's not understandable. Unless you have a suicidal mind, you can't understand what was happening in their mind when they took their life. You can guess, but it doesn't make sense. You're not going to be able to rationally make sense out of it, which people tried to do with Glenn's. Well, you made him move out. He was despondent, so he killed himself. Put a little neat bow on that. And you can't know, and you can't change it. So if you could possibly stop beating up on yourself and stop trying to change the past. That's just suffering. If you try to change the past, it is just suffering. But what you can do is change your relationship with it.
I think that is the best message that we could, potentially end with here. And the idea that please live your life. You, like you said, you are still here, and live your life. And I would imagine for most people, I mean, that's a hard, like you said, a hard thing to do, but also potentially something that anyone that you lost would want you to do. I don't want to speak for anybody like that, but yeah, like you still have a life. And it's my hope as well that people who are having any struggles or suffering with this, that they will find your books. As of January 26th, they'll reach out. It sounds like they'll definitely be supported with that. Remind everyone what your website is. It'll be in the show notes, but anywhere that is important for people to find you, whether it's social media or your website. I'd love to read your blog post. So I think
Thanks.
that's very helpful for people, even, in general, to potentially read that and your insights on that.
Okay, great. Yeah. And eventually, it's not quite up yet. There'll be a page with meditations on it. So you'll be able to go there and take a little 5-minute meditation break. So my website's inhabitjoy.com. And there are lots of blogs on there, and links to my other 3 books that are out, obviously not the new ones yet. When you first go to the site, there's a pop-up to get a free transition anxiety management toolkit. I think it's called Transition Anxiety Toolkit. So all of our transitions can be difficult, going on a trip, coming back from a trip, even celebrations can be very anxiety provoking. So it's just some grounding tips. And when you sign up for that, then you'll get on my email list, and I send out blogs about every 2 weeks. So not too much, but there'll be a lot in the next, in the coming month, just ahead of the book, there'll be a lot. So and then I'm on Instagram, Michelle Ann Collins with an underscore, because I had Michelle Ann Collins, but lost the password. And then I'm also, I know, Facebook, Inhabit Joy. Where else am I? I'm on Alignable. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me.
We'll find you everywhere. Thank you again. Well, congratulations, first of all, on the upcoming books. I'm so happy for you and excited for you to have published, more books published out into the world. Again, listeners, mark your calendars, January 26th. It's not that far away. And so grateful for you being on with me again. And thank you also to our listeners for joining us today for a new episode with Michelle and her updated adventures.
My other thing that happened, other funny thing. Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Laura. I love the work you do and your podcast, and I really appreciate it. You're bringing some good stuff into the world.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to My Life podcast. For more information, visit my website at www.lauramuirhead.com.